St. Louis, an all-white jury will decide the fate of two white police officers, Dustin Boone and Christopher Myers. They've been accused of assaulting their black colleague, Luther Hall, who was working undercover in 2017 during protests over the police killing of a black man. Now, a jury is supposed to be picked from a fair cross-section of the community, a pool of people reflecting the community's racial and ethnic makeup. So why is there an all-white jury impaneled in East St. Louis, a city where black people make up 96% of the population? Well, there's a little more nuance involved in this case, which we'll get into in a bit. But the one prospective juror, a black man, almost made it on the jury, but the defense successfully argued his dismissal. Why? Because he had a cousin who was convicted in 1996 and sent to prison, and he still kept up with his cousin's mother. The prosecution raised a Batson challenge. It's an objection on grounds that the other side struck a prospective juror based on race, ethnicity, or sex. The side being challenged would then need to provide a race-neutral reason for the strike. In this case, the defense never provided that reason. They argued that they struck a white woman for the same reason, so without a discriminatory pattern present, the judge denied the prosecution's challenge. Here to break this down even further is criminal defense attorney and director of Strike for Cause Jury Consulting, Robert Swafford. Thank you for coming back on, Robert.
So thank you for having me on. Just really an excellent, succinct explanation of how the Batson challenges work. And so I'd like to just jump off on where you started and go into a little bit more detail of this. So as you said, a preemptory challenge, and that's what I think they were using here. A preemptory challenge is a challenge that you can use for any reason except an illegal reason. So it is illegal to strike someone based on their race. And so as you described, when that happens, and then when the other side raises an objection, raises a Batson objection, then you're asked to provide a race-neutral reason. And so what the defense lawyer said was, as you pointed out, is, well, they have a relative who's incarcerated. And so it's a real interesting thing, is because statistically, a African-American juror or potential juror is statistically more likely to have a relative that is incarcerated. And why is that? Well, it's because of systemic racism. And so you're using systemic racism that exists as an excuse and a correlation as to why you're striking someone. And so so it's a very interesting conundrum that you get into, where you're saying, well, because we live in a racist society and they have these qualities, then that's why I'm striking someone who's African American.
Well, the last time you were on, you gave our viewers a primer on how jury selection works. For those who might have missed that, can you briefly explain how jury selection is more of a deselection process?
Absolutely. So what happens in jury, like you said, it's a misnomer. Jury selection is you bring in a large number of people. So in this situation, it is in federal court as opposed to state court. So if you're in a state court in East St. Louis, then the panel that you're picking from would probably be largely African American. But because this is in federal court, they're drawing from a larger group, larger number of counties. And a lot of those counties are rural counties. A lot of the counties are largely white. And so what happens is you bring in this mix, this large pool, and then each side gets to strike a certain number of people. And those are called preemptory strikes. And it's the people who are left that become the jury. Now, you can also strike people for cause. And when you strike someone for cause, what you do is you have someone who says, I can't be fair, I can't follow the law, I can't follow the judge's instructions. And I've also seen prosecutors use strikes for cause to try to eliminate African American jurors whenever they're striking somebody who is an African American defendant. And in this case, it's flipped because you have a defense lawyer who's essentially doing what a prosecutor would normally do.
Now, Robert, when we talk about a criminal defendant's right to be tried by a jury of their peers, we talk about how problematic it is for a black or brown defendant facing an all-white jury. In this case, people could argue that these white cops are on trial and they are in fact being tried by their peers. So talk to me about why it matters when a white person faces an all-white jury.
Well, a jury of your peers doesn't mean people who are just like you and think like you. You know, but
Yes.
what you want a jury to be is a representation of the entire community, not just some portion of the community that's favorable to you. A fair
Mhm.
jury isn't necessarily a favorable juror, and so the thing is that people make decisions based on two things. They make decisions based on the facts that are coming in, and then the filter through which those facts go. That gives people what I call their occurring reality, how the world occurs for them. And that is shaped by your life experiences. And so if you have very different life experiences as an African American person growing up in East St. Louis than you do in rural Missouri.
Now, when we talk about how a jury should be representative of the community from which they're picked, we know that there's a substantial evidence, or there is substantial evidence that suggests that jury pools across the country don't often represent a fair cross-section of communities. For instance, a trial attorney in New York said that Manhattan juries rarely have more than one or two black people on them, and that would surprise most people. What explains the lack of diversity?
Well, so there's two things. There's the pool as a whole that you're deselecting from, and then there's who actually ends up sitting on the jury. So one thing that I think could very well make a big difference is just how poorly jurors are paid. And so if you own your own business or you work for a government agency or a corporation that pays your salary, whether you show up or not, or if you're a wealthy retired person, then going and being on a jury could be something that is fairly easy to go ahead and fulfill on that. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck and your juror pay is going to be less than the parking fees or the bus fare, then I think that that's something that we really need to look at.
So how can we ensure that juries are more diverse, Robert?
Well, I think one thing that you can do, well, there are two things. The first thing is the pool as a whole, right? I think if people know that they're going to be paid adequately, people are less likely to want to try to get out of jury duty. So that's the very first thing, and will show up. But then the other thing is we have to look very seriously at the ways in which lawyers and judges have their own implicit biases, and they bring those implicit biases to eliminate substantial parts of the community. And I can think of one example of a case I was involved in Dallas, in which it was a very high profile quote unquote political corruption case, where during the voir dire process is the process by which you get to question the panel. One of the jury members said to the prosecutor, "Listen, everyone can see what you're up to." And the prosecutor, U.S. attorney, said, "Well, I don't know what you're talking about." And she says, "You're calling on African American women." And then he said, "Well, I'm not up to that. I'm not up to anything, and I'm sorry that you think that." And then proceeded to ask the question. Well, that particular panel member was an attorney, and she ended up on the jury, an African American attorney. And in that situation, there were acquittals. And so the thing is people need to be called out the way that panel member did.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that's going to happen often as it should. But we, again, can talk about this all night, Robert. Thank you so much for coming on, criminal defense attorney and jury consultant. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.